All right, we need to finish up these notes on section 4.1, talking about inverses. So we're talking about finding the inverses of quadratics. And if you understand that a quadratic is a parabola, so you'll notice here that we're restricting our domain on our parabola to x is greater than 3, which means basically we're focusing on only half of that parabola. So we're focusing on this part of the parabola. So if we imagine the inverse of this over that y equals x line, we're going to end up with a graph that looks something like this, which is the square root of this function. So what we're going to end up with in the end is a square root function for our answer. So we did the same thing. So we switched the x's and y's, and then since I'm solving for y, I need to move the 2 to the other side. So right now we would have a problem where it is x minus 2 equals y squared minus 6y. So the only way to solve a problem like that is to use completing the square. So right here at this point we're going to complete the square. So we're going to take half of 6, which is 3. 3 squared is 9. So we're going to add 9 to both sides. So we're going to add 9 to this side. I already moved the 2 over. And so we're going to add 9 to both sides. And then reducing that problem, you get x plus 7. And this becomes a trinomial square, so it's y minus 3 squared. So now I want to square root both sides in order to find the final answer. So when I square root both sides, I get plus or minus the square root of x plus 7 equals y minus 3, and then I'm going to move that 3 over. So at this point I have the possibility of 2 solutions for my inverse. Alright, so here's my original parabola, x squared minus 6x plus 2. There's my y equals x line of symmetry. And here is one of the possibilities. Okay, so when I graph this, what you have to understand is that with the parabola, all I'm focusing on is this right-hand side of the parabola, because I'm only looking at the values where x is greater than or equal to 3. So I'm only focusing on the right-hand side of the parabola. So if I look at this line here and I reflect it over the y equals x line, they should be touching right here. The inverse line and the y equals x, the parabola should be touching right here. So this point right here on the parabola should be over here somewhere. And that's not what's happening with this this inverse line. So if I switch it and I make it the plus instead and I graph it, so now again here's your y equals x line, your parabola, and there's your inverse. Notice that inverse and the parabola are touching at that correct point. You'll notice that this point over here would flip over the y-axis, the y equals x line to right here, and you've got your inverse there. So your inverse is just going to be the 3 plus square root of x plus 7, not both parts. And so now when we're looking at this, we also need to restrict our domain, so x has to be greater than or equal to -7, because remember you can't have 0 you can't have negatives in the square root. Okay, so let's look at another example. So we have, again, I've gone ahead and switched it, so I've got x equals y squared plus minus 6y. I'm going to go ahead and complete the square, so half of 6 squared equals 9, and I'm going to add 9 to both sides. I'm going to factor this part here, which is a trinomial square, and I get y minus 3 squared, and then I'm going to square root both sides. So again, when you're looking at this, a decision can be made about whether to do positives or negatives based on the sign. So if it's less than 3, I'm going to do negative. So my final inverse is going to be 3 minus the square root of x plus 9. And again, x has to be greater than or equal to -9. So that's my final inverse on this one. Okay. Let's see if we can do one more. Let me find an example. So I know I have one in here. Sorry, I should have had this ready. So one more inverse problem, and we're going to look at y equals x squared plus 4x minus 1, and we're looking at x is less than or equal to negative 2. Okay, so we're going to go through the same process with this one. Okay, so this is a new example. We're going to go through the same process. So we're going to go ahead and switch our x's and y's. And then I'm going to go ahead and move that 1 over. And then we need to complete the square. So half of 4 squared is going to equal 4. So that means I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So this becomes x plus 5, and this becomes y plus 2 squared. Okay. Square root both sides, and I get plus or minus x plus 5, and I get y plus 2. So then I'm going to end up with negative 2 plus or minus the square root of x plus 5 equals y. So now, since x is less than negative 2 is my initial restriction on my domain, that means I care about the negative values or the less than values. So that means my final answer is going to be negative 2 minus. So my inverse is going to be negative 2 minus the square root of x plus 5. And x is going to have to be greater than or equal to negative 5 to restrict my domain on this one. And so that's my final answer. So I hope that helps.